Apartheid in South Africa was quote unquote easier. It was just a brutal, naked injustice. Whatever the other side was that a certain clever kind of white person could have come up with, other than just thinking of black people as inferior, I wasn't aware of it. No, that's easier. The Palestine situation is uniquely complex in terms of the history of it. And not only 2,000 years ago, but exactly what went on in, for example, 1948. Unfortunately, you have to kind of study to really understand it, to just look at the checkpoints and say apartheid is rhetorical. It would make for a good opera, but it's for a very different reason.
Can I get you to respond to the question of what is a Black intellectual's role, or would you, if any, in the tradition that we stand at the endpoint of now, of African-American intellectual reflection on social and political machinations in this country? If you don't like quotes, me black, you white, that's all that matters. Do you give any order to the idea that there is a kind of historical responsibility that comes with being an African American with a megaphone at the New York Times in our time? And if so, what is it?
Well, one is there's a negative answer. In the grand scheme of things, the responsibility of the Black intellectual in 2024 is not to focus on identifying ways that racism still exists. You have to call it out when it's there. But if that's your main beat now to show that racism isn't over, you're narrow, you're self-indulgent, and frankly, I find it a little lazy. You call it out when you see it, but it's okay for us to open our eyes a little bit more widely now. And it's our responsibility to acknowledge the complexity. And I try to do that in the Times. And acknowledging complexity doesn't mean always letting white people off the hook. And I know that I have a certain reputation for, like we say that Charles Blow writes the same racism column every week. And that's not really true. If you want to talk that way about me, it's that every column I write is showing that a black person did something and that I don't like it and defending white people and not liking it. And, I've probably written that column 5 times. And if anybody really looked at what is now almost 200 pieces that I've written for the New York Times over the past 3 years, that's not what I do. I'm trying to acknowledge the complexity of what we see. And I defend black people as much as I criticize them. And I really work hard before criticizing a black person. I really think, is this necessary? So that's what I think. The responsibility of today's black intellectual is to open our eyes and allow and welcome that it is no longer 1950, that it is no longer 1980, and to point the way to where we can go now, acknowledging the obstacles, but understanding that it's nothing like what it used to be, and that we can stand on our own 2 feet and also resist the condescension of white people who have taken in an oversimplified message that not being racist means that we're all babies. And yes, there are people who are doing this who I respect very much. Thomas Chatterton Williams is one of them. Tyler Austin Harper, who we've had on, is another one. These are the people, Chloe Valdari, these are the people who should be taking us forward. The people whose main interest is in identifying discrimination and structural racism are limiting themselves, and by extension, limiting all of us in focusing unduly on something that is, frankly, suspiciously easy and also inevitably based on a rhetorical kind of exaggeration. That is my answer to that question.
You don't want to leave out Coleman Hughes and Camille Foster in your list of...
Why did I leave them out? It's because they don't have 3 names. So yes, Coleman Hughes and Camille Foster certainly are on that list.
So just hypothetically, I mean, you were alive and sentient during the anti-apartheid protest in the United States.
That was when I was in college. Yeah.
And African Americans' situation in the United States historically couldn't be more different than the historical situation of the South Africans. I mean, that was settler colonialism. It was not slavery. And it was what it was with the complexities of South African society.
Yeah.
And yet, many Americans, many African Americans, political figures, intellectuals, writers, artists, were personally engaged in, as it were, the struggle for freedom of the South Africans. Would you, and it's a serious question, dismiss their identification with such a historically and politically distinct phenomenon, which bore little resemblance to their history? But because the protagonists in that case and in their own history were Blacks, and the opposition over and against which they struggled to secure their freedom were quote unquote white, would you be dismissive of the sense of whatever allyship?
Hmm.
And could you see somebody, maybe a Black Muslim coming off the south side of Chicago who follows the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and his protege, Minister Louis Farrakhan? And please don't get mad at me for invoking these people. They exist. On the south side of Chicago, they exist. And they have followers who would identify with the Palestinians on a similar kind of connectivity. Would you be as dismissive of them or of the ones, the African Americans who identified with the South African struggle as you are of Ta-Nehisi Coates? And if so, why?
It's a good question. And frankly, apartheid in South Africa was quote unquote easier. I mean, it was just a brutal, naked injustice. Whatever the other side was that a certain clever kind of white person could have come up with, other than just thinking of Black people as inferior, I wasn't aware of it. That was me in college. And for anybody who wants to do historical research, I was at Simon's Rock and at Rutgers, and nobody who was there will have any memory of me participating in any political activities because I really was quite cut off from things like that at the time. I'm kind of ashamed of it now, but I remember it well. And yes, many Black students identify with it, although actually even then, certainly at Rutgers in 1984 and 5, was mostly white kids who were protesting and sleeping out on the street, et cetera. That's a whole story, but nevertheless, no, that's easier. The Palestine situation is uniquely complex in terms of the history of it. And not only 2,000 years ago, but exactly what went on in, for example, 1948, exactly what went on in the 20s. Unfortunately, you have to kind of study to really understand it. To just look at the checkpoints and say, apartheid is rhetorical. It would make for a good opera, but it's for a very different reason. So no, I completely understand the South African identification, and I understand identifying with Palestine. Not everybody is going to do the kind of homework that you have to do, but it's different if you write a book that's going to sell in the millions. You have a responsibility. So yes, in both cases, but I still have a real problem with this particular